Hello, I'm Pedro Cabalar, and my co-author is over there, Paulo Santos from Brazil. So this is more or less the scheme of the presentation. Our main motivation is playing with this kind of puzzles you can see there in the picture, where you have strings, you have hold objects, wooden hold objects, or metallic hold objects. I'm going to suggest to pass one of them over there. Just unfortunately, I didn't bring the big one, so it's just you can grasp an idea of the kind of things we are trying to solve, right? The motivation is essentially the same motivation that John McCarthy proposed for puzzles in AI. And it seems that it's an analogy that was made by a Russian mathematician called Gromrod that said that chess would become the Drosophila for AI. I don't know if you know the role of Drosophila in genetics, but essentially it's just studying some simple example so we can really understand the meaning of genetic information. So this is also the same motivation here. So we focus on a particular kind of problem. So if you want to reason about the strings and holds, we can focus on puzzles which have enough complexity, but they are very focused on the problem we try to solve, right? And of course, puzzles can become a challenge both for problem solving, but our main concern until now has been a problem for knowledge representation. So somehow I'm going to explain what we did in the journal paper, which was oriented to knowledge representation. But in the end of the talk, I would like to talk about what does this mean in terms of problem solving, which I guess is the main interest of this community, right? One first thing is that it's quite difficult to think that you could solve the puzzle by representing the full geometrical information. Indeed, people do not solve the puzzle that way. They don't measure, they don't have angles, they don't have three-dimensional coordinates. That's not the usual way you do it. You actually use something which is actually an area in knowledge representation, which is qualitative spatial reasoning. However, it has to be said that although there is a lot of work in QSR, there's very few work dealing with the strings and holds, right? This is the reference of the journal papers, so you want to have a look at it, you can do it. And it was focused in a given puzzle, which, as I said, unfortunately is not the one you are trying to play with. As the Fisherman Folly, you can find it in many toy shops and stores. And maybe some of you could already know about it. You have to remove the ring from there. And so the goal state is that the ring is completely free. The configuration of the rest of the puzzle is not relevant. So you just have a goal condition. Nothing can be crossing the ring, right? One first misconception that we usually hear is that this is a topology problem, right? And this is not true. This is a constraint-related problem, because from the topology point of view, the ring is out from the very beginning. So the topologists could say, you know, okay, that is out. There is no problem there, right? Because you can stretch things as much as you want, so that you don't have constraints, really. And another typical misconception is that you require some kind of internal spatial condition in your brain, so this is not formal reasoning, but this may be true in the way people solve the puzzle, but it's not true in the way you describe the puzzle solution. So, for instance, when you read the solution typically the puzzles bring a solution in textual description, and is it too low? Because This textual description is quite close to a formal representation. That was what we did. We started from the textual description of the solution to try to find out which kind of ontology, spatial ontology we were dealing with. So this is our goal, as I said before, and the goal in the paper in particular was related to formal representation, so we were concerned about representing this as a theory of reasoning about actions and change. So we could represent action qualifications, ramifications, and of course trying to solve the frame problem. So regarding representation, what we did was identify the objects in the puzzle and, very importantly, the holes, right? Which sometimes is not so straightforward. For instance, it took quite a lot of time to understand this ball as a hold object, right? Because you can slide things and it behaves as a hole. So for each hole we identify two faces. This is something people do not do, but if you want to make a formal representation, it is relevant. So it's not the same passing one thing to one face or the other. You get quite different things. So you have a positive and a negative face for each hole. And we also have long objects, like the string, where you have also a positive and a negative tip. And the main structure we used was this list-based fluent. It's a fluent which is a list that describes all the hole crossings you have when going from the negative to the positive tip. So for instance here, we would go through this hole, then through this other hole, and then through this other hole. We use this kind of schematic representations. So for instance here you have the string is crossing this sphere, the post hole and this other sphere, whereas the post is crossing the ring. So the post is also a long object, although it is rigid instead of flexible. We have several predicates to describe somehow static things, although, for instance, this one can be converted into a fluent if you allow cutting things. We also consider that. So, because you may be interested in finding the optimal plan for the puzzle, but you may also be interested, imagine you have a real mess, you may also be interested in finding an optimal plan that makes as less cuts as possible, and then unties the knot. And this part was really tough, because the constraints are really important. If you don't have constraints, as I said before, you don't have a planning problem, right? And it's not that easy to get them, because you have to describe which things cannot pass through which things. And the planner will need it, although you visually don't need it somehow. There are things you don't try when you try to solve the puzzle, just because you understand that the ball cannot pass somewhere. But if you want to give a formal description, you have to consider all of them, all of the relevant information, right? And this is somehow a weak part of the problem. I will comment about it later. The main action is passing a thing or a set of things through a hole. We describe this as a bundle. A bundle is a set of what we call nodes that can be tips of a long object, a whole object, or a regular object. And when they are linked together, you have to pass all the bundle through the hole. And essentially, this has two main effects. If the bundle contains a tip, you create a new crossing in the long object of that tip, right? And if the bundle contains a whole object, this whole object may be crossed by another string, then you will generate crossings in that string. I will just show it with a pair of diagrams, better than with formal representation. So, for instance, this is an example where you are passing a tip, right? So, this is the list of crossings, and you are generating one more crossing here. In fact, this is the first movement you have to do to solve the puzzle, right? And this is an example of passing a a hole that is crossed by another string. So you are generating these crosses here in the secondary string somehow. To solve the puzzles, all the steps you have to do, here I have not shown the list, only the diagrams, just to, you can make an idea. Here we pass this downwards, so we generate this. Then we pass this from upwards to downward, and then we move this ring through this hole here, and finally we slide the ring through the sphere until we get the solution. So actually, in terms of this set of actions, you only have to do 5 steps. We built a planner, which was a knife planner. It was a 2 pages prologue program, which made iterative deepening in blind search. And we were able to actually test that this is the shortest solution, right? And we also play with the action of cutting things. So the shortest one is just cut this connection here, and then the ring falls down. That's it. From the formal point of view, what we tried was to avoid the use of this fluent, because if you think about it from the formal point of view, this fluent is encoding the whole state. So you are just actually playing with lists. The list is like a representation of everything you have in the state. So from the reasoning about actions point of view, this is not very elaboration program. You actually don't have a description of the ontology of the domain. In the string, you have segments. You can talk about that segments. And if you want to derive ramifications from the things you do, the list is not actually a nice representation. So what we did, besides playing with the list doesn't give you a good tool for proving correctness of properties. What we did was representing the whole scenario in a combination of situation calculus, which I guess is well known, with quantified equilibrium logic. Let me just give a pair of notions about the latter. It's a formalization, logical formalization of the stable model semantics for logic programming. So actually, you can see it as the logical formalization of what we have today as ANSYS programming. It has the same syntax as first-order logic, but the meaning of connectives is slightly different. For instance, negation represents default negation. So when you see a not, you are saying if you cannot prove something. And implication behaves as a logic program rule. So actually it's like an inferential rule, right? The definition can be seen in the paper. It has monotonic logic and then model minimization criterion on top of it. There is also an alternative definition which looks like circumscription, like a variant of circumscription. So in this representation, we avoided the use of a list. We have 3 fluents, actually much more, but the main fluents are next, xy, and the words xy. Let's say we divided the string in segments, so you are saying which is the next segment to segment I for the long object x, and the words represents which is the next crossing. These are a better example of formula in the paper. So for instance, passing the tip looks like this. If you cannot prove that it's impossible to pass a bundle towards phase B in situation S, and you have a tip inside the bundle, and the next situation, this is the do function in situation calculus, is S prime, and D prime is the opposite phase, and so and so and so, right? Perhaps the relevant thing here is that we have to use new Herbrand functions, new constructors, to describe the new crossings, right? So you actually go generating new crossings all the time. For instance, this is the other example I put, where I moved a whole object towards another whole phase, and we have to generate new segments in the string. Right? Yes, we have a look here. This would be the formal representation of this new segment. And of course, if you make a new crossing, you will have to nest this function a lot of times. This is a representation of inertia rule. And this would look, this is how it looks making qualifications of functions. In the paper, we also solved other puzzles in the same, let's say, in the same family that require the same set of functions. So, for instance, this is the rope ladder. It requires 12 steps to solve, and but things get quite messy. This is just the second step, right? Right now, we are considering other things that were not contemplated here. So, for instance, we were not able to represent the situation where a hole is partially crossing another hole, or the situation where you create a string loop. And this is essential for other family of puzzles like the one you have right now. Because a string loop behaves as a hole. So you can pass through things there, and you can get equivalent puzzles where you do things with the string loops. Moreover, if you close a string, you generate a ring. And that is also a hole. Okay? So this requires a more fine-grained set of actions and a more fine-grained set of states. So if you try to solve the original problem using these intermediate states, things get much more complicated. You have much longer plans. Right? So this is the passage you are seeing there, and these are here you can see areas that actually behave as holes. We still have a big problem because we have inner areas formed by a string and then outer areas that are formed by sets of objects that generate a hole. So if you think about the chain has a lot of little holes, but you can form a big hole with the chain, and the chain actually can behave from the more abstract level, behave as a string. So I wanted to introduce a bit of discussion here, which can be the interest for the planning community. First, we don't have a complexity assessment, and we think that this is really important. What are we trying to solve, actually? And we have infinite crosses, although the puzzle doesn't allow an infinite number of crosses because you have a limited string. The formal representation does. So in principle, you could nest the string as much as you want. And you could begin doing things that doesn't make sense at all, like passing the same object 300 times through the same whole direction and get a big mess. The planner is trying to do it because it's doing blind search. So we have a search space which is infinite with arbitrarily large states. I don't know right now how would you do this in PDA. Probably we are thinking, we are not experts, so maybe you can give us some ideas. We are thinking about probably putting some limit in the length of the lists or things like that. But even representing a list, I'm not so sure how would you do that. And if you go to the fluent-based representation, we have these functions that can be nested arbitrarily. So somehow you don't escape from the list-like representation. And things get much worse if you go to these things like string loops or even something we are not considering at all that are knots. What about heuristics? So, for instance, people do solve these puzzles more or less reasonably well. They have some intuition of things they can do and things they shouldn't try, right? And somehow they have partial goals, and they know that they should not increase the complexity of the puzzle unless you have a partial goal. They don't begin making crosses randomly. If they do something, they are trying to get to a particular intermediate state. How do you detect these intermediate states, and when to do so is something which is really unclear for us. And constraints. Constraints are essential, as I said before. I described all the constraints, but where do I get these constraints? In fact, when you play with the puzzle, you learn the constraints while you are playing. You try something and then you say, oh come on. The ball doesn't pass through here, I have to replant. right? So imagine that you try to do something like this with a robot. Should the robot know all the constraints from the very beginning? I don't think so. And related to this, how formal is this? How can we prove that that when we say no, there is no plan? What does this mean? So from the physical point of view, how can we prove the physical feasibility of the plans we do and the physical impossibility when we say there is no plan? Right? These are open topics. We don't know how. Actually, we are trying to make a 3D representation and a correspondence for making this proof, but this is not trivial at all. So conclusions, we obtain a detailed formalization of a family of puzzles dealing with the string of calls. We are currently studying new topics like these string loops and even knots. Right now we are considering this. Could we build an efficient planner for solving this kind of puzzle? So for instance, the rope ladder with the naive planner was practically impossible to solve. There was no way. And we are also considering potential application areas, although this is something still very, very preliminary. So that's all.
Thank you.